Alors, bienvenue à Montréal, si vous êtes à Montréal. Euh, je suis enchanté d'accueillir Jean-Rémy KING, qui est chercheur au CNRS à l'École Normale Supérieure, actuellement détaché chez Meta AI. Il dirige l'équipe Brain and AI. L'objectif est d'identifier les bases cérébrales et computationnelles de l'intelligence humaine. Les travaux portent principalement sur le langage, avec le développement d'algorithmes d'apprentissage profond permettant de coder et de modéliser l'activité cérébrale enregistrée par le MEG et le EEG, ainsi que le IRM. Euh, le, Son titre a changé. C'est maintenant le langage à la recherche du code neuronal. And now I'm going to switch to English. I'm not going to read the abstract because you've already seen it. I'm just very happy to welcome Jean-Rémy KING, who has made the accommodation to the planet Earth to present this rather in English than in French. But you can ask questions in either language, and Jean-Rémy will answer in English. And even if you're, si vous êtes francophone et vous ne comprenez pas la réponse, il va peut-être répéter en français. Jean-Rémy, à toi.
Eh bien, merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. So, needless to emphasize how remarkable language is in our species. It's presumably because we have language that our species develops so differently from other species on the planet. Language allows you to share knowledge extremely efficiently and to transmit information from individual to individual in a way that completely bypasses the slow transmission of information through natural selection. And of course, behind this obvious fact, there is biology, right? There must be somewhere in the brain a dedicated neural architecture, a neural structure, which allows us to acquire a system of language, so to acquire an ability to learn an extremely large vocabulary, arbitrary vocabulary, and to learn or adapt a set of rules to combine these words to understand and produce sentences we've never heard before. And so that's the whole goal here. One of the, let's say, historical goals of cognitive neuroscience, and also to some extent of AI in the past, although now this is becoming slightly shifted by the new technologies, which is to understand what architectures allow our brain and not the brain of other animals which can of course communicate, but which cannot communicate with a compositional language like us. And of course, this, as I just said, is being revived. This question is being revived by large language models. Now everybody can use a language model and observe empirically that these models are remarkably efficient at mastering a language. They can produce and understand language remarkably efficiently. And this allowed us, for the first time perhaps, to have a computational model of language that does work. And the whole goal of the enterprise that I'll try to highlight in this presentation is to try to see whether these artificial models could help us understand how we process language. The approach that we undertake is becoming pretty standard in the field of neuro AI, which consists in directly comparing the activations or the representations of these models to the activation or the representations of the human brain in response to the same experimental condition. So for instance, let's start with an example study that was led by Juliette Millet and Charlotte Cocheteux a couple of years ago, where we compared the fMRI brain responses of healthy individuals who are listening to podcasts and audiobooks in a scanner. And we compare these brain activations to the activations of an AI model, which in this case is called Wave2Vec 2.0. And this is a model which takes as input the raw audio waveform and with a self-supervising loss learns to extract useful representations and which is one of the backbones nowadays, still today actually, of most speech models. So how do we do this comparison? Because it's non-trivial. You don't know a priori what artificial neuron or which artificial neuron to compare to which biological neuron or voxel in this case. So the classic recipe, the classic method that we and others undertake is a so-called encoding model, which is just a linear regression. You're trying to see whether, given the activations of your AI systems in response to sound, whether you can linearly predict the activation of the brain in response to the same sound. Let me show you a cherry-picked example of that. So on the horizontal axis here is the time axis from the beginning of an audiobook that people listen to in a scanner. And in the vertical axis, this is the amplitude of the brain, of the bold response in fMRI as a function of time in one voxel, which happens to be in the superior temporal lobe. And the black line is a true measurement. So at the beginning it goes down, then it goes up, then it goes down, and so forth. And the red line is the result of that linear regression. You can think of this as a virtual neuron sitting on top of this AI system, virtual neuron optimized to resemble specifically the activations or the function that is approximated in this voxel. And the two curves are not quite identical, right? They have obvious differences. But on average, if you were to correlate the two, you would find a decent correlation performance. You would say that in response to the same input, the virtual neuron in the AI system and the bold in this particular voxel tend to respond similarly. And so because the same input gives you the same output, we can empirically here assess that the functions are approximately the same. This is for one cherry-picked voxel. We can repeat this operation for every voxel in the brain. And what you see here is the result of that correlation map. So all of the colored voxels are the voxels that are predicted above a fairly conservative chance level, given the activations of the AI system. And it peaks in the superior temporal lobe. That makes sense. When you listen to an audiobook, it activates the auditory pathways in the cortex. But this in itself is not that interesting. What is... Yes, Gary? I think you're muted. Sorry.
Are you correlating that with the average over all the subjects, or are you trying to correlate with individual subjects? Like what does this represent?
Yep. Yeah, so we do this, we do both in the most recent papers, but in this case, we do this regression for each subject separately. We end up with one correlation value for each voxel of each subject on a test set of each subject. And then we average these brain maps to get the population. So these are fairly low correlation values because it's very hard to predict the raw fMRI at the individual subject level without any averaging procedure.
Okay, thanks.
And this in itself, I don't think is that interesting to just observe that there is a significant mapping. What is, to me, much more striking is to repeat this analysis, not for all of the activations of the algorithm, but for each layer of the algorithm. So you can take, you input the audio, oops, I lost my cursor. You input the audio to the DeepNet, you take the activation of the first layer, you try to see whether this first layer linearly predicts all of the voxels. Then you do the same thing for the second layer, try to predict whether it's linearly predictive of all of the voxels and so forth. And what you see here is the result of the maxima. So for each voxel, we can say which layer best predicts this particular voxel. And so we end up with an over-the-top 3D animation, but the non-animated one is as follow. You see that the voxels in the primary and secondary auditory cortices, where of course, the sound arrives in the cortex, these activation seems to be most linearly predicted by the first layer of the transformer in wave 2 vec 2, whereas voxels that are higher up in the auditory hierarchy, so the anterior temporal lobe, infrafrontal gyrus, Broca area, you see that these voxels tend to be color-coded in orange-red, meaning that their activations are most linearly predicted by the deepest layers in the network. And to me, this is really striking, right? Because wave 2 vec 2, like many of these AI systems, has not been explicitly designed to resemble the brain. But training this type of algorithm on naturalistic data leads it to learn a hierarchy of representations which seem to linearly correspond to the neural hierarchy of, in this case, speech processing in the brain, as that have been typically described in the literature. It can even highlight things that we expected but never quite showed, which is the hierarchy starting from the motor and premotor regions here, probably the larynx area, control of the voice, which climbs up to Broca area over here. All right. fMRI, of course, is not well resolved in time, so we can apply the exact same type of recipe, but for magnetoencephalography recordings, which are well resolved in time, but not in space. The linear mapping this time is happening time-locked to individual words. So the healthy volunteers are listening to stories, in this case to Sherlock Holmes in the scanner. And for every word on set, we can cut a little window, a little segment of brain activity, and try to see whether there exists a linear mapping between the activation patterns on the MEG and the AI pattern in input with the same text. And what do we see? We see that, first of all of the different layers here that are color-coded climb up around word onset. So as we get closer to the word presentation, the similarity increases between brain activations and this model. But perhaps more importantly, in this context, is it climbs up first for the first layer. So the first layer is shifted to the left as compared to the last layer in red, meaning that the brain activity patterns first resemble the first layer of the deep net and then resemble the last layer of the deep net. So it's not just about the anatomical organization, it's also the sequence in which this neural representation changes that seem to be statistically similar across these AI models and the brain. Now, this was, yes, Mario.
Yes, I just want to verify because you said it's striking, but shouldn't a deep learning network starts learning from specific features and then abstract representations like the brain specifically do? In general, for example, in the visual cortex, from V1 to higher areas like, V5 and also for language?
So, I mean, whether it's striking or not, it really depends on where you're coming from. Let's say that a couple of decades ago, 2 decades ago, the idea that machine learning algorithms that are not constrained by biological principle would learn things that are similar to how the brain processes information, I think would have been quite something to defend. I've had a sufficient number of grant proposals rejected to testify that. But nowadays, I think this is becoming more and more common. Like we see this type of similarities in the vision domain, in the language domain in this case, but also in motor control, reinforcement learning. So it seems, and I'll try to present some evidence for this, that this is a pretty robust thing, and perhaps now less surprising that it may have been a few years ago. Yeah.
I think his question was more about the predominance of the last layer as you get to the word onset and how in vision you have simple features and then you go to deeper features that are more abstract. And I think he's asking about,
Yeah, I mean, presumably, yes.
wouldn't you
And
expect that this order of the layers based on the results from vision?
yes, this I agree. Although context in language makes the order of computation quite different from the brain response to a static image without context. But maybe I'll go over this in the next slide also. So what we do now in the team is we pretty much systematically benchmark every model that's available on Hugging Face to try to see, okay, which one is statistically aligned with brain activity. And generally speaking, they are all way above chance. And one other sort of general tendency that the bigger and the better they are, and the more they tend to resemble the brain with this linear mapping type of metric. Although the very large model, the largest models, seem to break that tendency, so that this tendency of this correlation between how big the model is and how much it is aligned with brain activity may actually saturate. One thing that we see also very clearly is that the amount of context that these models have allow them to be more and more similar with the brain. If you input these models with just a small amount of text, like the last sentence or the last paragraph, their activation pattern will be less similar to those of the brain than if you were to input them with the full story that preceded beforehand. And this effect of context is also boosted by the size of the model. So if the model is bigger, having a larger context makes it even more similar to brain activity. And maybe this relates to your previous question. When we look at the layer analysis, we tend to always find a similar type of trend, which is that we have an inverted U-shape pattern between the similarity of the brain on the y-axis and the depth of the representation that we are exploring. So it tends to be, on average, the middle layers of these LLMs that tend to be the most similar to the activation patterns of the brain, as opposed to the very last or the very first. And the way I conceptualize this is that you need to process any complex task. You need to go to an abstraction space. And then next token prediction or other downstream tasks are actually quite arbitrary. You don't need to understand everything for this. And so you go back to something which is more constrained than your abstract space that you built in the middle. That's sort of how I see this. Right. All right, so one of the big questions there is, okay, so what? We have this mapping between brains and AI systems. What can we do with this? Why does it matter? I think we should emphasize how just wonderful this is from a theoretical point of view. Again, I think it is important to understand what makes these crazily different systems. I mean, they are extremely different from how the brain is wired. Why they still represent information similarly to us. And I think this relates to a concept which is well explored in biology, which is the concept of convergence. So in the classical archetypal cases, the wing of bats and birds, very different species, very different lineage, and yet you see that these species developed functions and structure which are analogous. They're not identical, but they are analogous. And why are they analogous? Because they are trying to solve the same problem. They're trying to solve movement in the air with an energy constraint. And maybe this is like close to an optimum approach, basically. And so perhaps this is the reason why we have a convergence of representations between LLMs and the brain. It's because they are trying to solve something about understanding the world and under some constraint, for instance, compute memory. Then the best way to represent the world is through this specific geometry that we observe. But this is just philosophy, and perhaps something which is more concrete. Why would this matter? Is that it really empowers us with a linking function to study representation. In other words, to say that we have a new tool to decompose representation in the brain. So, for instance, you can learn to map an LLM to a population of individuals and test whether this mapping that you observed in a given study holds on a completely new study, zero shot, whether you could predict the brain activations of new individuals listening to new podcasts, new stories, and verify whether or not this would work. And this was not possible before. You can do transfer across languages. You learn the mapping between French listeners listening to French stimuli, learn the mapping between the LLM and the brain, and then apply this mapping to English listeners listening to English stimuli, and observe that you are in fact able to linearly predict the activation patterns from this mapping. Yes, Stephen.
Actually, these are all good and justifiable generalizations you're talking about, but when you did that homology map, I mean, this convergence map, there's a lot behind those convergences for the bats and the birds that are not there between language models who are really, really impoverished in their input and humans. And there's development and many modalities, etc. Do you have any views that you want to mention before you give the analogies, the correlations that you're about to give now?
So I think this is up to scientific inquiry. Like, I think the idea of convergence is likely to be true, but the whole point of science is not just to have a rough idea about evolution, but to try to precisely understand the mechanism by which evolution is actually implemented. And in this case, it's the same, right? Like, it's good to say, well, it's interesting to say that we have a convergence, but we also want to be much more precise and see, okay, what exactly is being similar, what is being dissimilar, what type of mechanisms are at play, how does it work in a transformer as compared to a recurrent neural networks, and I won't conclude on this. I think this is ongoing work in the community, but I do entertain the utility of having a bigger picture in the back of our minds at the same time.
It wasn't exactly that. I was talking about the impoverishment of the input of the language models compared to the human case. You can't say that between the bats and the birds.
Right. So they don't have the same, they're not exposed to the same input. But I think in the same way that I suppose bats and birds are not dealing with the exact same environment. I mean, I'm trying to push the analogy here, but bats are mainly moving at night, and maybe the air is fresher, the airflow is not the same. So yeah, like different constraints, but that doesn't prevent you to try to make these analogies in the first place. It doesn't mean that they are identical, but yeah, it's still helpful to try to understand why they came up to this solution in the first place. But I think I think this is just philosophy. I don't think it's necessarily highly empirically grounded. It's very clear that LLMs, well, it's less and less clear nowadays. Even 2 years ago, it was still very clear that LLMs were text-based only. They didn't have any agentic behavior, so they couldn't interact with the environment. They trained with many more words than any humans on the planet. And so all of these are critical differences. But nonetheless, like, seeing that they do have similarities, I think is a source of wonder. The last comparison I wanted to show is between reading and listening. So you can learn to map brain activity to people listening to sentences, and then apply this to individuals who are reading sentences, and it also works. All right, but of course, it's not just about language in the adult functioning human brain that we want to understand, but it's also that for the first time, we have models that learn language. We didn't have that before. And there is still a huge gap, of course, in this learning, which is most obvious just by the amount of data that they have to ingest. So kids typically learn language from a few million words. LLMs typically learn language. This slide is outdated, from trillions of words. And so, of course, their algorithm is far less efficient than ours. But nonetheless, for the first time, we have models that learn. However, it's very difficult to study how the brain acquires language for a very concrete reason that having kids stay still in an fMRI scanner while listening to sentences is difficult. But so recently what we did with Pierre Bourdillon, who is a surgeon and a researcher at the Hospital of the Rothschild Foundation in Paris, is to investigate the brain activations of children listening to audiobooks while they were implanted with intracranial electrodes to treat their epilepsy. So the setup is as follows. So the little kids suffer from intractable epilepsy, very severe. You want to do surgery as early as possible because the brain is much more plastic early on in life than later on. And you want to make sure that the brain area which are resected will not prevent them to have, for instance, the ability to speak or move. And so they are implanted with these stereotactic EEG electrodes inside the brain for about a week. And after the week, depending on whether the seizure is well localized, the source of the seizure is well localized, typically the corresponding brain areas can be removed. During that week, what Linnea Evanson, the lead author on this study, did is to ask the legal guardians and these children to whether they would be happy to participate in a fundamental research study that consists in listening to Le Petit Prince, the Little Prince. So she made an app on a phone that she lent to them. And when they felt like it, they could just play a chapter. And then we have the timing of every individual words of the chapter. And so we can time lock the brain responses to those words and do this linear mapping that I mentioned to you before. So we recorded 46 patients from 2-year-olds up to adulthood. 2-year-old is the minimum age at which where brain surgery can happen, because then before that the skull is not sufficiently rigid and it creates risk for surgery. And so what do we see? We see that the brain responses to individual phonemes carry the expected representations. They are short-lived. So T0 here is the beginning of phoneme. We see that each line is a different phonetic feature. And we see that phonetic representations are mainly coming from the expected early auditory and supratemporal lobe areas, short-lived for about half a second. And these representations seem to be, at least from a statistical point of view, similar across age groups. If we focus on high-level representations like lexical information, whether a word is frequent or rare in natural language, whether it's a noun or a verb, then we observe that these representations are distributed in these electrodes. They are longer lasting, they last for about 2 seconds. And although they are present and detectable in the youngest group, these representations seems to be more fragile than what is observed in the older children. All right. And we can do the same type of mapping, this time with an algorithm that actually learns language, and observe a similar property, which is that the more the children develop or get older, and the more their representations correspond to the trained representations of, in this case, Llama 3.1, so just a typical large language model. There are many limitations to this type of study, of course. So these are epileptic patients. The development of language in these brains may be delayed or abnormal. The comparison that we do between brain activation and large language models is very coarse in many ways. Like the transformer is really not a biologically plausible architecture in many ways. The learning rule of the algorithm is also unlikely to be how we learn language, because predicting every individual word from the previous context is probably very inefficient for us, as we don't hear many words. And we still, even though we established this similarity between the developmental trajectory of the language model and the developmental trajectory of the human brain, we still don't quite know exactly what these representations are. So we just have a metric that says they seem to be similar, not what they are. But nevertheless, like this is, to me, very exciting because we have an unprecedented opportunity to build language models that develop and process natural language like us. All right. So this story that I gave you here, or at least a few bits of that story for language, can really be generalized to many more conditions. So we can do the same type of mapping between pre-trained representations of AI systems and the brain activations to a variety of conditions, to presentations of images and videos, reading text, listening to speech. And we need not necessarily be restricted to this linear mapping function. We can just train end-to-end a deep net to try to reconstruct brain activity given the experimental conditions. So why would we do this? Because then we end up with a model of representations in the brain. So here is a paper that we released last summer, which is a deep learning model trained to predict the activation patterns in fMRI of individuals who were presented to naturalistic stimuli, like watching TV series like Friends or Hollywood movies. And the model is called TRIBE because it's tri-modal brain encoder. So we have a video input, an audio input, and a text input, which are, all of these three modalities are embedded in pre-trained models and then combined with a transformer. And then there is, at the end, just a subject block which allows the model to adapt its prediction depending on the identity of the subject. So if it's subject A or B or C, you may want to have different brain maps. This model was the best model in the last year Algonauts competition, where the goal is to predict brain activity given naturalistic stimuli. So I'll give you here an example of how this looks. So people are watching this kind of videos. I removed the sound just to make it comfortable. And the left brain here is what the model predicts. The right brain is what is actually being recorded. And this is on the right. This is actually the average across many subjects. This is the HCP data. And this is why it's so clean. The model, of course, is noiseless from that point of view. And what you end up with is a model which, given any kind of stimuli, predicts brain activations. And you want to see whether it is a useful tool for neuroscience. So the first thing that we can evaluate is how good it is at predicting the brain activations of subjects that is never seen during training. So not only new stimuli, but also new subjects, what is called zero-shot prediction. And we see that it's fairly good in most brain areas. This is much, much better than what you would be able to do with a classic GLM or linear mapping. Each dot here is one individual. So it really shows you that quasi-systematically using these deep nets allows you to make brain prediction which are far better than what you would have done with your classic GLM approach. You can further, if you have new data, you can also fine-tune this deep net with this additional data to try to get even better predictions of the brain, and therefore have a more adapted model. One thing which is surprising is that it's even better. This model is better, is more correlated with the population brain response than any individuals that we investigated. So what you can do is, for a given stimulus, you can say, okay, here is the brain response of one individual, and how does this individual correlates with the rest of the population, and that gives you a correlation map. And you can do the same thing now with the model. You can say, what is the correlation between my tribe prediction, my model prediction, and the rest of the population, and observe that, in fact, the model is always better, or nearly always, there are a few exceptions, better correlated with the population than any individual. So it's like, at least from these experiments, if we were to be a little bit let's say, aggressive on the claims, you could say that it's better to actually look at this model than record an individual subject. Yes, Mario.
Yeah, the population here is the same culture, same language, same community.
Yeah.
What about the population here?
Yeah, so it's maybe it's an abuse of words to use population here. We have several data sets that we don't use during training. So in NASTAS, these are English speakers who are listening to podcasts. In these 3 studies, they are listening to The Little Prince, but these are French individuals, these are Chinese individuals, these are English individuals. And Aliko and Vanessa, they are watching movies. I think Aliko, I'm not sure where this is coming from. And Vanessa is of course, American. So yeah, I think we're still in the, I mean, it's a high regime for neuroimaging, but it's still low if we want to make big claims about population variability across the world. Yeah. Yeah, Stephen.
If I understood correctly, there are 3 sort of predictors in here that responds to text, to speech, and to images. Is there any way of quantifying the contribution of the 3 components to the fit?
Yeah, I'll show you this in the next slides. But before this, what we can also do is see whether this model can be used for non-naturalistic prediction. So you train the model just while people are watching movies and listening to podcasts, and then you present to the model a classic cognitive science experiments where, for instance, you flash very controlled images of places, of body parts, of written words, of tools, and you can evaluate 0 shot whether these predicted brain response correspond to actual measurement that people did. And this is data from the individual brain charter that was led by Bertrand Thirion in the South of Paris. It doesn't work every time. For instance, the FFA's response to faces is present, but remarkably weak as compared to what is actually measured. But overall, it's pretty striking how much you can actually do the same type of experiments or cognitive science experiments in the model, even though the model has not been trained for that at all. Of course, we can do this with language contrast as well. So we can do speech versus no speech, natural sound versus speech. You can change the content, emotional versus physical pain in a sentence, complex versus simple. And overall, it works. I mean, again, we have to be humble. It's not like 100% correlation, but in many cases, we have like more than 50% correlation, 0 shot on data that's really the model has never been trained with. Is participants are just watching movies. All right. If you do ICA, you can find similar connectivity network as what is typically done during resting state. I'll just do this quickly just to answer Stephen's question. I don't have here the exact numbers, but what we can do is to partition the variance explained by these 3 modalities and rediscover a thing that perhaps we already know, but it's always nice to see that the activity that is coming from the early auditory region is best explained by the auditory pathway in the model. If you go a bit more interior, so you climb up the speech hierarchy, you see that now you have a yellow pattern. What does that mean? I mean that these voxels tend to be best contributed by a combination of auditory embedding and text embedding, which makes sense, right? It's what we would expect. If you go to TPJ or prefrontal cortex, it tends to be really the text that dominates the explainable variance. And to my surprise, I'm really wondering whether this is a bug or a feature here. The back of the brain is blue and green. It's a combination of video embedding and audio embedding, which would suggest that, in fact, the auditory representations in these naturalistic settings do contribute to the visual activity. But that's quite surprising to me. I'm not sure that I would be very confident in saying that our model did not, I don't know, produce some sort of bugs here. One thing that I should really stress is that the model is not just modeling the average population and an average brain. Like, because we have this subject block at the end of the model, we learn a variety, a distribution of brain responses. So we can really see, okay, how would the model predict subject 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth, to see how these representations vary across individuals. Yeah, all right. So that's a large foundation model to predict, decompose, and inspect perception and comprehension in the human brain. We can outperform linear pipelines, zero-shot predict new tasks, new subjects, and further improve with fine-tuning. But perhaps what is most exciting to me is where this goes, right? Like, it shows that we may be able to have a slightly different epistemology to cognitive neuroscience, where instead of having each lab collecting data on a very specific task, doing one analysis, then throwing away the data, I think there is here a demonstration that there is an alternative here, which is to collect those data and learn a model on all of this to try to build a very general predictive model of brain activity across experimental conditions, so that then we can probe this model, decompose this model, try to see how it fell, where it fails, and what its underlying mechanisms are. All right. Okay, all of this is in the encoding domain. We're trying to predict brain activity given the pre-trained representations of AI models. And as you may have seen, the prediction scores tend to be low. Like the best correlation values we get are 0.5, 0.7 if we're really lucky. But most of the time they are around 0.15, 0.2. And this is because we're trying to predict raw fMRI brain responses. And so often you may wonder, are all of these things really meaningful? Like, are we really modeling the representations of the brain, or are we playing with like sort of statistical effects that may not be that interesting? And one way to convince ourselves that we are capturing rich and meaningful representations is to do the reverse, to try to do decoding. So here's an example that was led by Alex Desfossés in the team before he made his startup, where the healthy volunteers were listening to stories in the scanner, and there was data that we collected with Laura Williams back when we were at NYU. And we learned with a deep net to maximally predict the most likely speech sound and word given the MEG signal. You do this for a lot of snippet of MEG data. And here is a typical example where the participants are listening to a story. In that story, there is a sentence, which is, "Thank you for coming, Ed," which is specifically selected for the test sets here because Eddie Chang is the pope of speech decoding in the brain. And I thought that was a fun sentence for him. Anyways, so the subject tree here is perfectly decoded. "Thank you for coming, Ed." Subject 2, the decoder makes mistakes. The decoder indicates that the word "what" is more likely than the word "thank." And it's saying that the word "in" is more likely than the word "ed." These are mistakes. And for subject 1, it only makes mistakes. You, to, author, writing, them. But if you pay close attention, you'll see that the true word, "thank you for coming," it's there, it's present. And why is it present? Is because it tends to be in the top 10, top 20 most likely words output by the decoder. And there are 700 possible words in this task, so it's a fairly large vocabulary. So being in the top 10 or top 20 is, in fact, way above chance level. Since we pushed that approach with Stéphane Dascoli in the team, we analyzed the brain responses of 700 plus participants listening or reading sentences to try to specifically decode meaning of words and targeting word embeddings. And in many cases, it works remarkably well. So for instance, on average, when people hear the word extraordinary, the most likely word which is output by the decoder is indeed extraordinary. But the second most likely word is uncompromising. And the third most likely word is exceptional, absolute, exceedingly. If you look at other words, for instance, indeed, the most likely word on average is indeed decoded to be indeed. But the second most likely word is yes. And then you have certainly, ha, oh, surely, precisely. And so it seems that on average, we are able to really extract the semantic representations of these brain patterns to an extent that we can reconstruct the meaning of individual words. One way we think that this could scale, especially in the domain of intracranial recordings, is because these models do not need to use well-controlled experimental data. So for instance, this is a paper which is now on arXiv that was led by Lucy Zhang and Linnea Evensen. We did the exact same type of decoding analysis in patients who are in the epilepsy unit. And we, instead of trying to align the brain activity patterns to the wave-to-wake embedding of the story they're listening on a phone, we did this alignment between the brain activity and the ambient sound recording, because they have a microphone in the room anyway. So at every moment of the day, we know what they hear to some extent. Well, we can embed the sound of the room in wave-to-wake 2, collect brain data, try to see whether there is a mapping, and do this on hundreds of hours, and indeed observe that the decoding performances improve, decoding error diminishes. Yes, Mario.
Yeah, just why there is a focus on epileptic patients?
Well, yeah, so these are patients who have electrodes inside their brain for about a week. And of course, you don't want to implant anybody with electrodes for research purposes, right?
So because they already have recordings for
Exactly, yeah.
epileptic. Okay, thanks.
Exactly. And so they tend to, they have to wait for a week in the clinic, and it's a pretty boring environment. And so many of them accept to participate in experiments, I suspect, just to, well, maybe they're just very kind, that's always possible, but also because it's extremely boring, right, to have to wait for epileptic seizure to occur for a week. Right. This was decoding of the perception of language. We can also try to decode the production of language. And this is very hard technically, because when you're in the fMRI scanner or when you're in the MEG scanner, if you speak, this creates huge artifacts, huge movement artifacts, especially in MEG, like muscles create electric signals, or muscle movement create electric signals. And so this completely disrupts the sensors around the head. So what we did here with Svetlana Pine, who is a researcher at BCBL, and this is work that was led by Jarod Levy and Lucy Zhang, is to move away the artifacts from the brain sensors and ask people to type. And so the experiment is pretty simple. It's they see a sequence of word, then there is a delay period, and then they have a cue, and they have to type the same sentence without any visual feedback of what they type. And what you see here, is a result of that analysis in a paper which will be out in Nature Neuroscience very soon. So the true sentence is the one on top. What they actually type at a given instant is this. And the last line is what the decoder can reconstruct. And so you can see that, and these are like continuous sentences here, they're not cherry-picked. So you can see that the decoder makes a lot of mistakes. But in many cases, you can actually reconstruct and understand the sentence which is being typed solely from these MEG signals. So in the best individuals, we have 80% character level accuracy. So far higher than what I was anticipating, but far from any practical device, I should say. Like a 20% error rate is really not practical, without even considering the issue of MEG being an extremely large scanner.
What happens if you add a beam search for sentences after this? Can you get back to 100?
Paper number 2 incoming, but yeah, it's not public.
Okay.
We have an engram in this first paper that tries to correct a little bit for this, but it's in Spanish and all this, and I think we were in a bit in a low data regime, and the next one is going to be better. All right, so this was a focus on language, but this idea of having representations which are aligned with pre-trained network is, of course, very well established by now in the context of vision. For instance, if you take a self-supervised learning algorithm that is trained on images, like DynoV3, you can see that the activation patterns of the first layers of the transformer tend to resemble the early part of the visual system, whereas the deepest layers in the deep net tend to be linearly aligned to the much more interior parts of, it's not even the visual system, it's of the whole cortical hierarchy up to the prefrontal cortex. And because we have this alignment, we can reconstruct images. This is, for instance, work that was led by Hubert Banville and Johan Benchetrit. This is data from the Things Initiative, where participants watch images in the scanner, in the MEG. And at each moment of time, we can try to reconstruct the most likely image given their MEG activity using this alignment with an image embedding. And again, it's the results are far from being correct. Like there are many mistakes. This is tofu and not cheese. This is like a black and white bear. It's not a panda, and so forth. But it's still, yeah, to me, very striking. Like that this is even possible. Right. This work is much easier to do in the context of high field 7 Tesla fMRI, especially the natural scene dataset now is becoming very common for this type of task, and reconstructing plausible images from what people from the brain activity of people watching those images is really striking. Yes, Mario.
So we can conclude here that it's doing correctly, for example, for basic features like edges, for example, and then it will fill anything inside the shape. Can't we?
No, I mean it's always hard to do this analysis, but in our work and in other people's work, it looks like it's a mixture of a lot of things. Like we can decode low-level features and we can decode semantic features, but both of them are slightly incorrect. It's actually pretty difficult to, for instance, decode the category of an object and its position at the same time. Like this is actually a difficult task. So yeah, I think it's still quite unclear exactly what is being precisely decoded and what is just filling in from the diffusion model. I think that, yeah, there is a whole research on this, and I don't think we have a firm conclusion in the field.
Okay, good, thank
you. This works for static images. This also works to some extent for videos, which is again full of mistakes. Like these are not the right edges for sure, but the content is pretty striking in terms of movements and overall semantics. Of course, it's very off, but also strikingly similar. All right. Okay. I'm going to end up with this. So I think there is this tremendous opportunity with AI to have like these new tools to model and understand how the brain functions. Also because these AI systems also learn and represent the world. So this is a study on its own. But I certainly do not want to suggest that that's it, the job is done, and AI system process and understand the world like us. Like it really, it depends on what you want to emphasize, the differences or the similarities. But to me, there is one key thing that's really we have to never forget is the remarkable inefficiency of these algorithms. And language is really an obvious case for this. these language models are trained with just gazillions of text, whereas children learn from a very small amount of words and learn language from a very small amount of words. And only humans can do that. Like, people have tried to teach grammar to chimps and gorillas, and it just doesn't work, right? When it works, like, people are happy because the animal managed to combine two words. And so that means that there is an architecture, a neural system in the human brain that allows this learning, extremely efficient learning, allows us to combine words together. And the efficiency of this algorithm remains to be discovered. This is not yet found by these language models, for sure. Okay, so with this, I'll just highlight that this work is only possible because I had the chance to work with a tremendous team of collaborators at Meta and in academia, without whom this work would not be possible, and I'm happy to take further questions.
Thank you very much. That was a superb presentation. Extremely interesting. Anna-Marie already has a question. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for this talk. I have a lot of questions, in fact, and problem ordering them, but let's have a shot at it. What do you do with all this work on neuroimaging and which targets like Bromford area? Look, for example, Friederici and her team. Especially when you have a title like this, The Emergence of Language in the Human Brain. So I was wondering how all this research on what area of the brain fires when you have language, and why syntax is so important, because we see specific area in Bromford area for syntax and different area for semantics. But again, even then, it's not semantic of words, right? Doesn't mean anything. A word in a sentence may have many meanings, right? So the idea is that language is a system that relates, meaning to some sensory interface, right? And words, well, they do what they can, but without syntax, they can't do much if you can't do that. So if you focus on representation, what do you capture in the relation between meaning and a sensory motor interface, right? So isn't there anything that relates firing of specific brain area to a relation between meaning and a sensory motor area? Also, I'm not sure that one would like to explain as best as possible what happens in the brain when we are able to speak and convey meaning through sounds or text. But I think that there are problems, with these LLMs. One of them is this difficulty with recursion, right? So human language are one of the infinite languages that exist, right? And infinity is based with the possibility of discrete infinity like recursion, and doesn't do that. It predicts the next word, right? So in a sense, it captures a part of it, when you look at Charles Young, for example, that you certainly have read work of, he looks at language acquisition and says that statistics and probability has very low space in natural language acquisition by children, right? But so, of course, LLMs are programs. They're not genetically endowed with the language, okay? But then again, don't we want to have a more comprehensive approach to human language than that does more than just focus on speech, text, and statistics and probability, right? So I would have more to say, but I'm stopped here.
Yes, stop there and let
I'll just stop here.
I mean, thank you very much for the question. This is I didn't see that in the question you shared, Stephen. This is not an easy technical question. This is like 5 chapters on a books that remain
Yes.
written.
But just your view of this work that exists.
Yeah. So I mean, I'll try to answer some of the points. I won't be able to answer all of them, but
it's okay.
The first thing I'd like to highlight is that I think in the team and me specifically, I come from a school of thoughts which I think is very structuralist and therefore inclined to be like following the ideas of syntacticians, like structure, like composition, like very simple logical concepts. And as time goes by, I also see the limits of the concept that are behind this. The frontier between syntax and semantics is remarkably difficult to draw when we like have to actually study it in a scanner. The idea of recursion being like that we have infinite languages is really a theoretical concept. People do not handle very deep structure in language. We are pretty bad at that. So whether we are truly using a recursive algorithm underneath, I think remains to debate. Like Chomsky and the School of Thought has tried to dissociate the idea of performance from the true idea of language recursion. But in practice, this does matter. Like people do not handle very deep recursion structures. But I do want to entertain these ideas still. And I think the question here is whether these LLMs can be studied in light of these linguistic concepts. And I think they can. So for instance, there is one piece of work that I really like from Hewitt and Manning in Stanford from a few years ago that show that you can reconstruct very simplistically. You can find the syntactic tree in the activation patterns of the LLM. And the way by which this is coded is by distances. The word embedding that are close together in a subspace of the LLM tend to be the words that are syntactically connected. And to me, this is one way of trying to link these two worlds, to link the world of linguistics and theoretical symbolic concepts and this work of statistical learning and machine learning. The second point is that I think we really need to dissociate the issue of acquisition and learning from the issue of the nature of the representation. I think no matter the algorithm that learns, it may end up doing something which is similar to how the brain represents language. And I think that's actually what we're observing here. Even though the algorithm is trained to predict the next word or the next token given the preceding ones, and that's in all likelihood is not what we are doing, it nevertheless, by the end of the training, maybe it does represent language similarly to us. And that I think is an interesting thing to investigate. Here is one way, for instance, to try to join these words. What we did in this study is we did this mapping between the activation of the LLM and the activation of the brain, except that we did not input the same sentences to the model and to the brain. We input sentences which have the same syntactic structure. So for instance, you could have well, I think I have an example just right after. Oh, no, I don't. So you could have like, not very happy and really, really hot. This would have the same syntactic structure. And you can input these sentences which have the same syntactic structure but different meaning, collect the average activation of the model to see whether these activations indeed are predictive of brain activity. And this type of analysis allowed us to isolate through the prism of the language model the network which seems to represent syntax and the networks which seems to represent semantics. And these are fairly distributed effects. So there is a tension in the literature. Some people really have a local view of syntax. Federici is one of them. Some of them are much more distributed, like Fedorenko, for instance. And so this perhaps could speak to that debate. But that's like just one analysis. So of course, like it's up for like further criticism and discussion. But I don't think these LLMs prevent us to reinvestigate this old question that have been explored in the past through linguistic concepts. Yeah.
I will not ask more questions, but I would have some.
Sure.
Okay, not now.
We have a little bit more time, so you don't feel that constrained. Let me interpose. Okay, Mario, go ahead.
Yes, I have. Thank you first for the presentation. It's really beautiful presentation and very interesting. I have a question or maybe an idea for the future. Did you try sign language?
No, we haven't tried. We haven't tried sign language, but I think I would love to go in this direction. Just like this is yeah, we already have a pretty large front of research rather than deep. So yeah, I don't think we will go there, but the tools can be applied to any modalities. Yeah.
Okay, good. And very small comment. When you said it's surprising, the visual cortex or the back area of the brain, the blue and green, they combined. I don't think it's very surprising because usually different faculties in the brain, they compensate one to each other, so one to the other. So.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm just too close to my textbooks and experts here in the assembly, and Gary perhaps could tell some about this too, would claim that, or perhaps would defend one view or another. I don't have a like sufficiently knowledgeable view about this. I was surprised of the extent of the phenomenon, that there is feedback connection of the auditory regions to the motor cortex, to the visual cortex. Why not? But it is that visible. This was surprising to me. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay, I'll give it back to Anna Maria in a moment. Let me just impose a short question. The reason that I asked you about the what was coming anyway, which is what is the contribution of the three different factors, text, etc., was because I have another candidate other than convergent evolution and homology, and that is that what your commonalities, even in the brain, maybe reflecting, is features of language itself, which means that the people who poo-poo the fact that this is just word completion data, statistics, may be poo-pooing something that's much bigger when you're at the huge numbers of billions of or trillions of tokens. There may be things. The shape of a word in relation to what its meaning is arbitrary. But the shape of collections of words in propositions is not arbitrary. And you could be, in fact, reflecting the non-arbitrariness of the unique code, which is language, Not
only I agree with this, but I think I would go further, which is that it's not even language, it's the latent structure that governs the world is indeed identified by the brain and by these models, and this is what I think what is happening indeed. Like it's a very Platonic view, like that there exists these structures, and that through experience we can sort of approximate them. But yeah, I think that's what's that is what is happening. Yeah,
I wouldn't go so far.
The reason why, yeah. But I would. But the reason why I think it is non-trivial is that you could come up with sort of philosophical algorithm, like a lookup table, that would not have this property. So if you build an infinite lookup table with every sentence related to, I don't know, the next token and all this, you could break entirely the geometry that we effectively observe here. But these are, of course, like, not very interesting counter alternative. I think it's just being a fact now that these models seem to converge to these structures. There is one thing that I've never done, but I suspect is possible for mathematicians, which is that there exist ways to do to encrypt deep learning algorithms and to have functions that are similar in an encrypted space. And so I suspect you can also come up with algorithms which are functionally equivalent, like given the input, they give you the same output. But in the middle, everything is encrypted, and therefore the geometry is completely broken. So I think it's possible to come up with alternative and say we could have found an algorithm that were as efficient, knew how the world is structured, knew how the languages are structured, but nevertheless do not represent this information similarly, in that their internal geometry is not similar to us. Yeah.
So I'll get back to Anna-Maria in a second, but there's a question from here, and in fact, I can show the speaker to you. Go ahead.
Oui, bonjour. Alors, je me demandais, est-ce que...
Une minute, est-ce que tu entends?
J'entends, oui.
Ok, vas-y.
Du coup, ma question, c'est à propos, est-ce que notamment les modèles ici étudiés, genre basés notamment sur l'encodage et le décodage en parallèle avec le cerveau, genre ces modèles étudient-ils la pensée humaine, ou bien pouvons-nous plutôt dire que en fait, elles imitent la pensée humaine?
So the question is, do these models imitate or study human thinking? I think by design they imitate. Predicting the next token in language, given the preceding tokens, is trying to imitate the most likely language given the context. So I think that's really an imitation strategy. But yeah, I think today this is the case. Whether tomorrow it will be different, I think it's I think these AI systems are changing so quickly that it is not impossible to think that AI algorithm will be used to study human reasoning and human actions. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Bonjour, bonjour Jean-Rémy, merci beaucoup, c'était super intéressant. I will ask my question in English for people attending who don't speak French. My question is not technical, it has to do with governance frameworks of this kind of research. So I was wondering if you thought about all ethical issues regarding, for example, mental privacy, when we collect information from the brain and everything. And so do you think we should add to the existing frameworks this kind of refs that could, govern and manage and take care of the privacy of information?
So I'm not an expert in the regulation of these questions. But I can give you my sort of viewpoint from, let's say, someone who is a bit hands-on. So I think my experience, at least, is that there already is a regulation, especially in Europe. We have GDPR, which is fairly protective of personal data, and brain activity is protected by this. That does not mean that regulation should not change or adapt depending on development in technology. I think there is always a risk in misperceiving where the risk may be. So, for instance, the decoding of images is remarkably efficient nowadays. I think many of us would have not predicted that a decade ago. But trying to decode what people imagine, like if you ask someone, imagine an apple, like this is still very, very bad. And the reason for this is because the signal that we pick up with these fMRI scanners and all this is extremely noisy. And so no matter how good your AI system is, the noise is such that there is not much you can do. And so what people do typically is that they average the brain activity patterns across many repetitions, and then they show something which is flashy and convincing, but it's not at this stage, at least. I don't think there is a risk for, let's say, mental privacy and reading people's thoughts any more than there used to be a few years ago. Now I think we need to remain in the scientific community like careful, like and continuously provide elements to clarify the risks and opportunities with these new developments. That's also why we publish things and all this. So yeah, that would be my short answer. Being an employee of a big Californian company, I can tell you that we get a lot of scrutiny, but maybe this is for the better. but yeah.
Okay, I'm going to pass it to Anna Maria, but before it's yours, Anna Maria. But Grégoire Winterstein, you speak on the 1st of April, and if there's some comment that you have on a related topic, you're invited to say it here. I give it to Anna Maria. You can think, and if you decide you want to do it, just raise your hand. Anna Maria, toi.
Yes, I just want to say a small thing, but which has consequences. It's unclear that the brain is a system, it's a biological system that is devoted to predicting the next word for language, for example, because sometimes the next word is not audible or is not pronounced. Okay, for example, it's 2. So when I'm saying it's 2, it's like it's 2 o'clock, right? But when I say John is 2, I'm saying not John is 2 o'clock. I'm saying John is 2 years old, right? So the next word is not there. It's not audible. It's not in the text. But we humans know it, right? Because we relate meaning to a certain form. And sometimes this form doesn't have a substract, or it has to have some kind of representation where the representation said nothing is there, but there is meaning, right? So it seems to me that models that combine both or are specific to one and specific to the other and are connected have more chance in a way. It's like LLMs go from the sensory motor side to some representation, which is not the semantics, because distributional semantics is not compositional semantics, right? Because to do compositional semantics, you have to have syntax. So, but nevertheless, it goes from the sensory motor system to some representation. And the alternative systems, generative grammar based, let's say the word, right? They relate meaning to form. So how they do that? They hypothesize, they have machine to create structure without needing to calculate the height and the width of trees that you put in the processing, you know. So if you have that, if you have system, artificial system that create that, and you had them already some years ago, mathematical linguistics, right? You know, all these formal grammars that generates tree, and then you get the semantics because you have the structure, right? And then you get the sensory motor because you have a system that relates to that. So it seems to me that there should be maybe more discussion between a different perspective or theoretical schema and a related technology about language.
And Anna Maria, I have to cut you off again.
That's all.
You can have a response, Jean-Rémy.
All right.
You have a spot to make it in.
Okay.
And one other thing, all, if you have any prelude to what it is that you're going to be presenting that's relevant here, you're welcome to intercede as well. Jean-Rémy.
Well, it's an advertisement. I'll be trying to talk about whether we can devise experiments that compel or invite large language models to begin to talk with each other. And it's a little difficult. My inspiration comes from some animal experiments, and I should warn everyone that this will be a talk with no novel data, because we haven't started.
Jean-Rémy, si tu as de quoi répondre à Anna-Maria.
Yes. So again, I mean, these are deep questions. I'm a humble scientist, you know. I try to see whether we can we can decompose some of the mechanisms of the brains for language. But nevertheless, I mean, of course, I'm entertained by all of these big questions. The two things. So multimodality. Should we use more than text? This is, of course, like a lot of people have thought of this, and this is up for challenge, right? There are challenges today, for instance, the BabyLM challenge, where the goal is to learn a language model as efficient as possible with as little amount of text as possible. And there is an auditory track or multimodal track. But the fact is that these tracks where people are allowed to learn from other modalities, they don't outperform those who only use text. And that's just a fact for now. Like, we haven't figured out a clear way to use multiple modalities to make this algorithm work much more efficiently than just with text. So that's, I mean, that's where we are right now. But of course, there is research on this. The other thing that I want to emphasize is the learning objective. Like, I don't think the learning objective that is implemented in our brain is to try to predict the next token, but perhaps that's a good proxy. But that's kind of the whole research. Like, we want to understand what is the learning process, like what is the little neural algorithm in each of these cortical columns? What are they trying to do? What are they learning exactly for them to be able to learn so efficiently and presumably to learn even when people don't speak? Like, you have an inner thoughts all the time, like you are constantly building sentences in your head, thinking about what's going to do and reflect upon this and so forth. So I guess this algorithm is just like crunching data all the time, even in the absence of external input. And we need to figure this out. We need to figure out like how this is being built as a community. And our role as a little team is build tools to say, okay, how are we going to test that then? Are we going to have an algorithm that we can compare to the brain, to different brain regions, their dynamics, their spatial organizations? And that's where we modestly come in. But of course, that doesn't mean, it's not because we tend to be close to the data that we discard the theory. It's just that it's a division of labor. Yeah.
Okay, Grégoire, last call. If you don't take up the,
Yeah, I mean, I can ask questions and make comments, especially after what Jean-Rémy just said. I mean, my one comment is that at the end of your presentation, you go on this, large language models need trillions of words to learn, whereas children need a couple of millions, which I find extremely misleading as a statement, because as we know, children do not learn from just being exposed to strings of words. The learning experience of a child is not impoverished, it's extremely rich. So yeah, I agree that in the context of, for example, BabyLM, we know that last year the multimodal track was not particularly successful. They certainly did not better than the people who relied only on text, but that doesn't mean that the child only learns from 5 million words, right?
No,
so
of course.
That's yeah, I know, you know, but
no, but I agree. But I think it's important because the other animals also have the same amount of video and auditory information. So I here emphasize the differential. Like you can present as many books to a chimp, or you can have a child see as many videos as he wants. If the child is not exposed to these 5 million words, he will not learn language. And so, I mean, this is a key aspect of language. Like we are able to learn that, but of course, this sits on top of the whole cognitive machinery, which is shared with other animals and all this, which presumably can learn a lot of things about the world beforehand, before learning vocabulary and rules.
Yeah. No, but I agree with that. It's just that, there's more than those 5 million words. There's also the nature of the interaction that children have. And so it goes to another thing. They say, oh, we have a constant inner monologue. But it's known that many people report that they don't have this. Like it's not shared by every human speaker of a human language. So I don't know too much about that. So I don't know. They're not really questions. They're more.
Okay, don't ask a question. Give a word or two about what you're going to be talking about on April 1st.
Oh, on April 1st, I'm going to underline how, to a large extent, what we see in large language models productions comes from us rather than the model itself, because we are very good at enriching meaning in particular. And so we tend to attribute things that are not present in the output of such models. So that's
Thanks. We look forward to it. And I want to thank especially Jean-Rémy. It was an extremely stimulating and informative, productive session. And we want to thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stephen, for the invitation. Thank you all.